You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 342, The Paper Money Riots. Last week, we discussed the efforts by several national leaders to address the ongoing economic crisis caused by trade and commerce issues. This week, we're going to take a closer look at some of the problems that people were actually facing. I've discussed this before, but just as a reminder, money in the 18th century typically consisted of specie. That is, precious metal such as gold, silver, or copper, which could hold its value simply based on the fact that there was a limited supply of it. During the colonial era, Britain's economic system encouraged the extraction of most specie from the colonies, and it would be taken back to Britain itself. As a result, money shortages were a common problem. The colonial solution to this was to issue paper money. These were essentially notes that carried with them some promise that they could eventually be exchanged for certain other items, such as specie or other items of value. For example, in Virginia, some notes were tied to the value of tobacco. In many cases, the notes were never exchanged, but simply traded like regular money. Governments would often accept this paper money for the payment of taxes as a way to remove it out of circulation again. The obvious problem with paper money was that the holder could never be 100% certain that it could be exchanged as promised for something with real value. These were essentially IOU notes that were only as good as the word and the economic viability of whoever was issuing the notes. Notes from, the Bank of England retained their value because people had faith that the bank would exchange the notes and there was no real danger of bankruptcy. Many colonies had issued notes at various times. Problems arose when people were not confident of full repayment. When that happened, notes would trade at a discount. For example, if there was only a 50-50 chance of repayment, some might accept the notes at 50 cents on the dollar. So if you wanted to buy something for a shilling, you would have to pay for it with 2 shillings of paper money. This was known as a discount rate. The discount rate of notes went up and down all the time, and even might vary from vendor to vendor. You would essentially have to negotiate the value of your money. During the colonial era, this often became an issue when colonists tried to pay debts to merchants in Britain with these colonial notes. The merchants in Britain wanted to be paid in pounds sterling and did not want to have to deal with these weird colonial notes. They brought their complaints to the government, which often restricted the ability of colonial governments to issue paper money in the first place. During the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress and the states were, of course, free of any such restrictions from London. They issued paper money freely to fund the war and other government expenses. But since there was no guarantee that they would win the war, or that they would pay off these notes even if they did win, the notes almost immediately began trading at a deep discount, which got even worse as the government printed even more money. Officials sometimes tried to pass laws which forced merchants to accept the paper money at face value, and also often accepted it at face value for the payment of taxes. These mandates, of course, if followed, would often lead merchants to ruin. Let's say you owed someone £100. If you could go out and buy £100 worth of notes for £1 and then pay off your debt, you came out way ahead. The poor creditor who lent you £100 worth of real money essentially lost 99% of his loan. This led to the obvious result that no one wanted to lend money or credit of any kind. Merchants who were forced to sell their goods and accept paper at face value simply stopped selling their goods. During the war, this was treated as being unpatriotic and against the war effort, but patriotism was usually not a good enough reason for merchants to allow themselves to go bankrupt. Now, some of the notes issued during the war operated like war bonds. In an effort to get people to accept them, some notes would come with a date certain when they could be exchanged for specie, and some even offered interest on the money. Now, even with these, though, their value depended on how much you trusted the issuer to keep its promise. When the war ended, the Continental Congress was supposed to pay off the army everything that it promised. And to do that, it just issued even more paper. Soldiers, of course, needed money right away, sometimes just for travel expenses to get home. So they often spent their paper money, and this included their discharge certificates, which held promises of money, at deep discounts, perhaps only getting 10 cents on the dollar, maybe even less. The bulk of these notes ended up in the hands of speculators. These were men who thought they had a pretty good idea of their chances of being able to eventually redeem these notes at full value at some point. Some speculators were government officials themselves who would actually have a say on when these notes might get redeemed. The situation deeply divided people in many states. For merchants, they had taken great risk by buying up the notes, offering at least some money to people who otherwise would have had nothing. Their willingness to accept this risk meant that they should be rewarded by having the government pay off its notes in full as promised when it issued the notes. For the farmers, most of whom were former soldiers, they had gone to war for years, receiving almost none of their promised pay and having to give up years of labor on their farms when they could have been building up their own wealth. The idea that they should have to hand over everything they owned in order to pay off these already wealthy merchants seemed to them to be the height of injustice. Many farmers had borrowed money during the war to produce more food for the army. When the war ended and the army stopped buying food, they had trouble selling their crops at all, while the lenders still wanted those loans to be paid off. For most farmers, the solution was to have the government issue more paper money. This would allow them to pay off their debts and taxes using that depreciated currency, much like the currency that they had been receiving for their labor for years. Merchants and creditors obviously opposed this idea, since they wanted to get paid with real money and stop carrying all these notes of dubious and speculative value. The post-war recession and money shortages were causing problems everywhere. To make matters worse, Congress passed the Requisition Act of 1785. You may recall from earlier episodes that during the war and desperate for cash, Congress had been borrowing money wherever it could find any. Much of that came from European governments and banks who now wanted to be paid back. Defaulting on such loans could carry the loss of trade or seizure of property. In some cases during this time period, default by a government to another could result in war. While things had not reached that condition yet, Congress was obligated to make payments. Its hope had been to sell some Western lands, but that was still several years away. It attempted to set up federal tariffs, but the states refused to approve this plan. The only revenue source it had was to requisition money from the states. Congress had been trying to do this for years, and with limited success. In 1784, the state requisitions totaled about $750,000. But in 1785, this amount quadrupled to $3 million. About 30% of that money was needed to run the government. Another 30% was required for repayments to foreign lenders, and this portion had to be paid in specie. The other 40% would go to repay Americans who held government bonds. Many of the bonds were interest payments on commutation certificates. These were the papers that were issued to officers at the end of the war in exchange for having to give up their promised pensions. Up until this time, many states had been paying interest on those commutation certificates that had been issued by Congress. They would just give the money directly to the certificate holders in their states, deducting that amount from what they paid to Congress in its requisition. The 1785 requisition explicitly banned this practice. That requisition in 1785 was like throwing gasoline on an economic fire. The economic burden divided Americans and resulted in a variety of responses. New Jersey responded with somewhat of a, "I got your requisition right here," and refused any payment at all. Similarly, Connecticut refused payment, although I imagine they were more polite about it. Congress could not force the issue. After all, it had no courts, no police, no army. In other states, where influential merchants held a great deal of bonds that were due to be repaid through these taxes, support for paying the requisition was much stronger. Funds would have to be raised through higher taxes. This made the already almost bankrupt farmers even madder, but the merchants who would be paid through this scheme saw it as a necessary step to repay debts. Now, the case of Rhode Island is a good example of the problem, although they came up with a pretty unique solution. The state debt from the war was massive. Interest payments alone were over £10,000 a year. For comparison's sake, the entire government budget before the war was only about £2,000. So the interest they were paying each year was 5 times larger than the pre-war budget. The state had no western lands to sell and largely had to rely on taxes to repay both state debts and Congress's requisitions. The majority of the Rhode Island government was controlled by supporters of the merchants, who, as we said, had speculated heavily on notes and wanted to see them repaid in full. The legislature had approved an impost in 1783, which made all imports much more expensive for the citizenry. It even agreed to send 2 delegates to the Annapolis Convention that I discussed last week, but those delegates did not arrive until after the convention had ended. Like everyone else, Rhode Island was suffering from a post-war depression. The economic demands on the state divided them into 2 parties: the merchants who wanted full debt repayment using specie, and the indebted farmers who wanted to essentially get out of that debt by having the state issue heavily devalued paper money. Beginning in 1784, town meetings began sending petitions to the legislature demanding the issuance of more paper money. The merchants controlled the assembly and rejected these demands. In 1786, they responded to petitions by calling for all town meetings across the state to send their views on the issue. 90% of the meetings responded with a demand for more paper money. The pro-merchant legislators were shocked by this outcome, and in March 1786, still overwhelmingly rejected a plan to issue more paper money. The next month, Rhode Island held its annual elections, and the pro-paper voters tossed out most of the legislature and replaced them with officials willing to carry out their demands. When this new assembly met in May, it suspended the last tax collection and authorized the emission of 100,000 pounds of paper money. The money would flood into the economy through loans given to landowners. The law further mandated that the paper was legal tender. The state set up a system where if you owed someone money, you could just leave the money with the court. If the creditor refused to accept it, the government would keep the money and consider the debt paid. This forced creditors to accept the money whether they liked it or not. Later, the legislature added a 100-pound fine for refusal to accept the paper. 100 pounds was roughly 2 years' wages for the typical labor, so we're not talking about a small fine here. Multiple violations could result in a creditor actually losing their right to vote or run for office. It also created a special court to rule on paper money issues with no jury and no appeal. Despite these efforts, merchants did everything they could to avoid having debts repaid in paper that they knew was going to trade at depreciated levels. Continental Congress refused to accept paper money for payment of its requisition. At one point, when merchants were threatening to abandon the state entirely, the government considered a plan to take over most private businesses, including ships, warehouses, wharves, shipyards, etc., and just run them on its own through the government. It also considered requiring an oath to support paper money, and refusal to take that oath could result in a loss of voting rights or the right to run for office. One newspaper reported a proposed bill that would simply cancel all debts and redistribute wealth equally among the people, with the same redistribution process taking place every 13 years. Now, while that did not happen, the legislature did force the repayment of 1/4 of all state debt with paper money. The indebted farmers were happy with the plan and overwhelmingly re-elected the legislators the following year. The plan managed to greatly reduce both state debt and private debt at the expense of wealthy merchants who most people didn't like anyway. Over time, however, the paper money began to drag down the economy as merchants left the state or found ways to avoid the paper. It took several years, but finally in 1789, the legal tender mandate was dropped and paper money traded at a depreciated rate of about 7 cents on the dollar. Several neighboring states looked at Rhode Island's solution with great interest. Wealthy merchants realized they could effectively be stripped of their property if a majority of voters decided to do so. By contrast, indebted New England farmers thought this was a great solution to correct massive problems and inequalities that prevented them from making a living as productive farmers. In the end, no other state went as extreme as Rhode Island. But North Carolina also issued currency that very quickly depreciated. New Jersey and Georgia also issued paper which saw substantial but not crazy levels of depreciation. New York, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina issued paper currencies that depreciated a little but largely worked. They were largely used to provide loans to cash-strapped farmers. New York and Pennsylvania even used their money to buy continental securities held by their citizens, thus making the states themselves the creditors of the Continental Congress. The divisions between creditors and debtors was still very real and getting worse with continuing economic hardships. In New Hampshire, the dispute nearly led to civil war. As in other states, farmers feeling the pinch first had tried to address the issue at town meetings and through petitions to the legislature. In many cases, debtors were recently returned veterans who found themselves being thrown into debtor's prison for debts that they or their family had incurred while they were in the Army. As early as 1782, armed rioters in the town of Keene, New Hampshire, shut down a courthouse to prevent the court from hearing debt cases. The state's attorney general rode to the scene personally. The AG at the time was none other than Continental General John Sullivan, who had left the Army in 1780. He had served a few years in Congress, but returned to New Hampshire in 1781, shortly after having to take a personal loan from the French ambassador to cover his own debts. When Sullivan showed up at the Keene riots in 1782, wearing his Continental Army uniform, many of the rioters were former soldiers who had served under him. He was able to use their respect for him to get the protesters to disperse. The following day, he personally handled all debt cases before the court, agreeing to continue any case where both parties were not ready to proceed. Now, that resolved the immediate crisis, but the larger problem only grew over time. Debts forced many farmers to sell their farms. Many also faced debtor's prison. While they sent multiple petitions for relief, primarily in the form of requesting more paper money, the legislature, controlled by the supporters of the merchant creditors, simply ignored those petitions. In September, the legislature was meeting in Exeter. Locals in nearby Kingston hatched a plan to march on the legislature and force them to pass a bill for paper money. The men, former war veterans, formed a column of 200 and marched to Exeter. There, they surrounded the building where the legislature normally met. On this day, however, a judge was holding court there, so when the men surrounded the building, the court simply ignored them and continued with its business. Eventually, the protesters discovered that the legislature was meeting in a nearby church, so they formed up again and marched over. When they tried to do this, enough time had passed that a growing mob of locals confronted them, and they sought to defend the legislature. The protesters managed to surround the church and eventually refused to let anyone in or out. Once again, General Sullivan, who was by this time the president of New Hampshire, came out to engage personally with the protesters. While he was in negotiations, the locals, who were militiamen themselves, formed up into their own military column. They managed to convey the false idea that they were bringing up artillery, which caused the protesters to withdraw, but only across the river where they set up camp. Using this respite, Sullivan sent out messengers to call out the militia in other towns in the area, and by the next morning, about 2,000 militia marched to Exeter and then surrounded the protesters' camp. A few shots were fired, but it appears that no one was killed or seriously injured. After the protesters surrendered, the three leaders of the protest were indicted on charges of treason. However, they were immediately pardoned. Several militia officers who had participated were stripped of their commissions, though. The militia sent a request for towns to vote on the issue of paper money. Perhaps after seeing the chaos such policies were creating in Rhode Island, the majority of towns voted against paper money. Sullivan then banned the use of conventions to petition the legislature and sought authority to call out the militia himself when needed. He believed these emergency powers were necessary given the protests that he had seen prior. So while New Hampshire ended without bloodshed, that was not going to be the case in Massachusetts. And next week, we're going to take a look at that situation in Massachusetts, where Daniel Shays starts a rebellion. Hey, Thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Celentano, and Michael Mulhern. Thanks also to Robert Morris Circle supporters Patrick LeBeau, Kurt Avard, and Greg Pusak. I also want to thank Anthony Kibbe and Jason Van Hoosen for one-time gifts via PayPal or Venmo. I really do appreciate everyone who helps to support this podcast. Now, this week we covered some of the economic chaos that existed in the mid-1780s. And these events aren't remembered as well as the Shays Rebellion that we're going to cover next week. The main reason probably that Shays remember these or not is that no one was actually killed in these riots, as opposed to the events that took place in Massachusetts. Nevertheless, the problems were widespread. Violence was open in many cases, especially in New England, and this was a growing and a very real problem. I found the story of the Rhode Island financial games particularly interesting. Today, we would have considered many of the proposals that they were suggesting to be downright communist. Rhode Island gave us an example of when a people who were so sick of the exploitation of the system controlled by rich merchants that they were able to take over and use the power of democracy to tear down that system. It was a political solution that avoided the violence that we saw in other states. And despite a few radical moments and some proposals, the state did manage to get a hold of its economy over time, and did so without destroying the lives of thousands of farm families. I appreciate why wealthy merchants all over the continent feared what essentially amounted to a radical redistribution of wealth. The Rhode Island reforms may have had a greater impact than Shays' Rebellion on many conservative elements who eventually supported the Constitutional Convention. This was a really critical time in the history of the Republic. Most revolutions following this one were not only political revolutions, but also economic revolutions, and this sometimes led to a more equitable distribution of wealth, but more often than not, it ended up destroying the economy and making everyone poorer in the end. Economic reforms did come over time, but the U.S. in the colonial era never had the massive disparities of wealth that we saw in Europe between aristocrats and commoners. The post-war era shows us that the American people, using political power rather than violence, were often able to keep in check the kinds of disparities that threw Europe into the revolutions of the early 19th century. We will also see how the Constitution helped to keep in check the more radical proposals that could have resulted in stripping the wealthy of their property. The Constitution would forbid states from issuing paper money. It also created constitutional protections against the deprivation of property without due process and limited taxing powers. These events were very much on the minds of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention, which we will begin discussing soon. My book recommendation this week is Unruly Americans and the Origins of the Constitution by Woody Holton. This book takes a look at the political and economic chaos that existed during and after the Revolutionary War, and asserts that the Constitution was primarily motivated by the attempt to end that chaos and make America more of an attractive investment to outside European investors. The author, Holton, is a professor of history at the University of South Carolina, although he taught at the University of Richmond when this book was first published in 2007. He's written a number of books about this era, all with an interesting and non-traditional take on things. Now, only a small part of this book covers the events that I discussed today, but it does help to put events in a better context. So, if you want to read more, get Unruly Americans by Woody Holton. My online recommendation is an article from The Atlantic called The Paper Money Craze of 1786 and Shays' Rebellion. This is an older article from the centennial of these events, published in 1886. It's only 9 pages long, but it covers all the economic chaos of 1786 that led to these events. It's an interesting read, gives you more information on exactly what happened, and as always, I've included direct links to this article on my blog and website. My question this week asks, who were the most overrated and underrated generals in the Continental Army? Well, this was an interesting question that really made me stop and think. I'm often asked who the best and worst generals were, And for the best, I've usually argued that in terms of battlefield ability, I'd go with Benedict Arnold, at least in his pre-treason era. And for administration, George Washington. And for worst general, I typically go with the French General Matthias de Fermoy, who was a continental general for a while. But overrated and underrated are different. While Washington and Arnold had many positive traits, they were also very highly rated by their contemporaries and by history. Similarly, although de Fermoy was just horrible, most people have never even heard of him. To be overrated, I have to go with someone who gets a great deal of laurels, but really doesn't live up to them. Now, when someone asked me this question live, the first name that popped into my head was Nathaniel Greene. He gets really high ratings by most people, but I thought he actually did a terrible job in the early part of the war, but his really top abilities in the Southern campaign and the later years of the war were truly impressive. So I don't think he really was a fair choice to be picked as overrated. In the end, I would probably go with the general that I love to hate, Horatio Gates. Gates is one of the better-known generals. He's remembered as the hero of Saratoga. Many in Congress at the time even considered him a good choice to replace Washington in 1778. My own view on Gates was that while he was a capable administrator, he was a really terrible commander. This was never clearer than at the miserable performance that he gave at Camden in South Carolina, which essentially ended his military career. But personally, I also give him very little credit for Saratoga. Most of the work that led to that victory was the result of his predecessor, General Philip Schuyler, as well as some brilliant leadership by Benedict Arnold, who essentially won that victory by defying Gates's orders. On top of all that, Gates always seemed to be looking out more for himself than the cause. He abandoned Washington at the crossing of the Delaware in order to go complain to Congress about Washington. He allowed the Conway cabal to threaten to rip apart the army. He was also a big part of the problem at the end of the war, which only avoided becoming a much larger crisis through Washington's Newburgh Address. Overall, I think the Continentals would have been much better off without him. In terms of underrated, there are several you could put into the running. Richard Montgomery had all the markings of a potentially great general, but getting himself killed in the very early months of the war never really gave us a chance to see his full potential. Others, like General Greene, Knox, Morgan, did great things, but, as I've said, have been pretty well rated by their contemporaries and by history for their works, so they got good ratings, they can't really be underrated. Another critical person you might go with would be General John Glover. Glover played really critical roles in the retreat of Brooklyn and the crossing of the Delaware, but he never really particularly shined as a commander, and once he made general, you didn't hear much of him after that in the later part of the war. So for the most underrated general, I am going to go with John Sullivan. Over the course of the war, Sullivan performed well, both serving under others and as a commander. He took the blame for the Quebec campaign early in the war, although he took command late in that action and there was little he could really do at that point. He was captured at the Battle of Long Island and has also been criticized for taking a peace message from the British to Congress while he was on parole. Sullivan performed very well at Trenton and Princeton. He had some problems at Brandywine and Germantown, but all the leaders did. He also lost the Battle of Rhode Island in 1778 when the French fleet bailed on him at the last minute. So if you look at his battle record, it actually looks pretty poor. But I would argue that much of that was a matter of bad luck or circumstances that were really outside of the control of the commander, rather than him really being a bad commander. Sullivan also led the Sullivan Expedition against the Iroquois in 1779, which he performed very effectively, but these attacks on Indian villages are often looked on poorly by modern eyes. Despite all this, Sullivan was an effective commander. He played an important role in the final success of the war, and as we saw in the main episode this week, Sullivan continued his capable leadership, managing to end the Exeter riots of 1786 without bloodshed, something that we'll see next week that Massachusetts officials could not do. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me, either via email or on Twitter, which is now X. Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.